to just introduce him, I would like to tell something about Professor Ananda Mitra sir. Professor Ananda Mitra sir is affiliated with Wake Forest University, United States of America. As a professor, he's working there. Professor Ananda Mitra is a professor of communication at Wake Forest University. His research and teaching interests include media, technology, culture, data collection, data management, and issues surrounding Indian culture. He is also credited with the invention of the idea of nerves, and his principal research writing and practical concerns are in the ways in which technology is constantly reshaping our everyday life practices and calling into questions how we live our life within a constantly changing global space. He uses the theoretical approach of the primacy of mediated narratives in contemporary life as reported at the MediaWatch.com. He was educated at the Indian Institute of Technology, Wake Forest University, and the University of Illinois. He is the owner of an independent research agency called Management Learning Laboratories that specializes in applying technology to the collection, management, and visualization of data. He has been worked with more than 120 recreation agencies across the USA. So really it's a privilege for us, and I'm taking this opportunity, I'm just requesting sir to discuss about the topic, Sustainable Development Goal and Communication, which is quite a relevant topic.
Thank you. Thank you. Couple of housekeeping things before I get started. How much time do I, I can use this? Oh, I can, that's fantastic, yeah. How much time do I have and who is going to start me? 45 minutes, so we're starting right about, what time is it? 2:30, 3:15, right? Yeah, cool. So that everybody knows this, I am partially blind. You can tell, I think, looking at me. I don't see very well in this eye. So anybody on that side of the room, you kind of don't exist for me, unless I'm looking right at you. So just keep that in mind. If you're raising a hand, just shout up instead of just raising a hand. So the way I'm going to do this is, as I always do, it's highly, I'd like to make it as interactive as possible and kind of keep you all thinking. You know, it's a question of more of engaging and thinking about the issues than literally just sitting and listening to somebody, because that doesn't do anything. What I can see is, so who's running the slides?
So it's really
All right, cool, yeah. So the topic today is communication and SDGs, which is a very, very unusual marriage. Because SDGs, and I'll go through that momentarily, is a whole different, is an area of study or an area of concern which people like us who are communication scholars or communication teachers don't necessarily get involved in. You know, that's not immediately in sight for us. The reason I got involved in it and is because I was asked to talk about it, but let me tell you a little about my background. I have a training in IIT Kharagpur, training in chemical engineering, of which I know somewhat, a little bit. But very strangely enough, right after finishing my chemical engineering, I realized I wasn't that good an engineer. I was much better at debate and theater and stuff like that. And I left, I applied to go abroad, as everybody did in those days after finishing IITs. But I ended up going into communication and spent my entire career in communication, completely not doing engineering. But the fact is, 5 years in IIT Kharagpur does teach you engineering. You learn things that you don't ever forget. And so when the internet happened, I realized that there's a moment where communication has just changed radically. And so I started getting interested in how this technology is coming. And so I went back to technology quite a bit and started teaching courses on communication and technology. So that's how development comes into play. So that's my background and perhaps a little bit of the legitimacy as to why I can do this. And then some people ask me to develop a course in this. And I was talking to Mr. Short the other day at the Press Club, and I told him about the course, and he said, well, why don't we have a chat? But it's a whole course, it's a 10-hour course. So obviously we can't do that. But just to give you a sense, if I can go to the next slide. Right, can you all see that actually? Is that visible? Okay, so even if you can't see, it doesn't really matter. To start this conversation about development, sustainable development, and then eventually communication, we need to begin with the idea of development. What the heck is development? This is a seduction. I call it a seduction of development. There are several reasons. You go back to Adam Smith. When Adam Smith talks about development from a highly capitalist perspective, the father of economics, and he talks about the way in which development happens, what he basically is saying that development is driven by the profit motive. That's primarily what development was in the eyes of the capitalist look at development in terms of the Western capitalism. Which basically means that wealth was being created. Development is about wealth creation. And then comes along people like Marx and Engels, and you're looking at 1760, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, Adam Smith, all of that is happening. Marx comes along and talks about the distribution of wealth. The reason I'm saying that is because while Adam Smith is talking about accumulation of wealth, Marx talks about distribution of wealth. And Marx takes us to that point where we're going to say that there's got to be the proletariat revolution, right? Now, these two ideas of development continue for a long period of time. But something happens in the history of the world in the 1940s which completely changes the question of development. This is a historical analysis to some degree. You have to be historical and stay with that history. The war happens. So the war is a turning moment in world history, without a doubt. By the war, I mean the Second World War, right? So what does the war do? The war calls into question the whole structure of the political structure. The global political structure is called into question. How is it called into question? There are two things historically that has a lot to do with development that ends up happening. Three things. One is traditional colonial economics is called into question. The colonial economic structure, the colonial economic model collapses. And large tracts of land suddenly are no longer owned by the European colonizers, right? That's number one. And thus we get India. Thus we get Pakistan. Thus we get South and North Vietnam in different time periods, but more or less the same thing's going on. The second thing that happens is we come to a point where we suddenly realize that we can kill each other and destroy the world. And thus we enter the Cold War, right? Because everybody's got the bomb, they control it, they can set the bomb, but we're not going to use the bomb because we know we'll kill each other. Cold War. So these two things, and there's a third thing that happened in the war, which I'm going to ask you guys, and let's see if you know this. This is not a trick question, there is a correct answer to this question. How many bombs were dropped on continental United States during the Second World War? Exactly. None. Right? And keep that in mind because development has a lot to do with that. The first time we got attacked in our soil was 9/11 in modern history, right? After the Spanish-American War and so forth, when they burned down, when the British come back after the 1776 War of Independence, this is the first time. It has a lot to do with development. But the creation of these countries, clearly India, brings another model of development, which is the need to build a nation. So you go back to Nehru's conversations, the early days of Nehru's conversation. What Nehru talks about is nation building. And he's talking about development as nation building. Thus we go into the quasi-socialist system and we go into our planned economy. Some of you are old enough to remember the 5-year plans, right? What are we doing there? Development. We're not accumulating wealth anymore. We're not trying to redistribute wealth. We are basically saying we have nothing. We have no steel. We have no infrastructure. And we are left in that situation historically. We have to do it. Today we are making a joke about it, that we want the Kohinoor back. Ever heard of that guy is a British comedian who goes on Comedy Central? This is a guy who recently said that the entire British Museum in London is a crime site. Everything there has been stolen from somebody else, right? And this is what Nehru's are responding to. Nehru's responding to that. Nasser is responding to that. Back in the old Yugoslavia, Marshal Tito, right? So we start a developmental idea of non-aligned development. We're not going to align with the Russians, we're not going to align with the Americans, but we will make our non-aligned movement. But that is about nation building. But at the same time, what was also happening is you cannot ignore the power of capitalism. And the power of capitalism was the desire to find that global market, right? What did America have at the end of the war? They had an entire country, untouched, infrastructurally, right? We lost a lot of people. My neighbor's forefathers died in the wars, right? But not a single bomb was dropped. Not only was not a single bomb dropped, all of a sudden, when the Marshall Plan kicks in, right after the war, what America suddenly realized is that Europe is devastated. There's nothing left. You know, you still, even today, there are parts of Eastern Europe, go to Dresden, go to parts there, they're still rebuilding. Europe was bombed to hell, right? So now we have the question of the need for the access to the global market. The Americans wanted that, right? And that access came as a process of development and a process of media access. Think about how the Americans got into the media spaces in Europe. Because Europe had what? Europe was completely destroyed. They needed content. Hollywood was completely fine. New York was completely fine. We gave them content, right? And thus begins Americanization. Development as Americanization. And when Eisenhower finally gives up being president in the last address, he talks about, he warns us. He not only warns us as Americans, but he warns the world of the military-industrial complex. Right? Some of you might know that idea. The military-industrial complex where Lockheed Martin and Boeing will work with the Department of Defense in the United States, similar stories over here, and we create that military-industrial. And that needs a market, and the market is a war. Perpetual war is the market for the military-industrial complex, right? Why am I saying all of this in terms of development? Because there is an ideological imperative to development. Development is not just about building a new ship or building a new bridge. Development is fundamentally a political moment. It is an economic moment and a political moment. And how we define that political moment decides what we will call development. But, granted that part is true, can I get to the next slide, please? There are certain common factors about development. Let me shut up for a minute. Any questions? Any comments? It's really boring for me to just sit here and chat, talk. Any comments?
Probably they will be asking later on.
Okay, well, don't just keep asking. So what is the common factor? Once we understand that there are different imperatives for development, one of the most important common factor is the technological deterministic factor of development. Technological determinism as a theoretical moment is basically makes the argument that technology drives everything. We don't ever stop and think about what the technology will do to us, but because the technology exists, we will use it. It's a major construct in the history of technology. So the technological imperative is real important. The other common factor is the need for efficiency. And efficiency can be described in many different ways. Maximization of profit is efficiency, and as I've said over there, addition of infrastructure is efficiency. I'm drawing a distinction here. I hope you're following my logic. You know, if you're looking at it from the American perspective, the market perspective, efficiency is profit. If you're looking at it from the Nehruian Indian perspective, nation building, then that's building of infrastructure. That's what efficiency is at that moment. There's a scientific imperative. The science drives this. There's a myth in that, and I'll bust that myth momentarily, that we look only at the intended outcome of development. This is so darn important. Development is always technological, development is science-based, development has the imperative of either maximizing profit or building infrastructure, and we will say that we will look at the intended outcome. And development, speed matters, here and now, right? You can see that even today. Even today, if you look at research and development, it's all about speed. The only time speed actually mattered recently, and people actually said, you know, we will do this fast and do this right. You think of an example recently where we decided, as a global community, we'll do this right and do this fast. What did we develop? Come on, guys. What did we develop so quickly? Thank you, sir. Exactly. One time we said, it doesn't matter. We gotta save the world, right? But speed matters. Speed matters because, think about it this way. What was the first country to put a satellite in space? Exactly. Sputnik, right? What does Kennedy say? We'll put somebody on the moon, right? That's the American response. Speed matters. We have to do it, we have to do it now. Biden's saying something about putting somebody on Mars, and I'm going, wait, man, we still have a lot of problems over here on Earth. Let's look at that for a second. Now, Trump, speed mattered to him. He tried to build a wall real fast. That didn't work very well. But so then there is the ideological imperative, which our tool is better than your tool. So as a technologist, I'm going, geez, my tool is better than your tool, so seriously, what does that really mean? I'll give you a real life example. Some of you might remember this. How many remember a product called an iPod? You do, right? What was it? What was an iPod?
It was a device to listen to music. Unlimited run.
Right? iPod was a small device.
A very small device.
Exactly. It was an MP3 player.
Yeah.
Right? Was there any other MP3 players available in the market at that time? No, Sony Walkman wasn't an MP3 player. That was a cassette player. Somebody said lots. Can you think of others?
There was a
Creative Labs, Zen.
Yeah.
Why the heck did everybody want an iPod? Was that tool better than the other tool?
The brand.
You know what iPod did? You're right. iPod did not sell an MP3 player. They sold a lifestyle. That's what it did. Their marketing was marketing a lifestyle. And if you did not buy that, you were not cool. It was the cool factor. I used to have a Zen MP3 player, which I still felt was better in quality than the iPod. But that is what I mean, is your tool better than the other? Not necessarily. So, the takeaway from this conversation so far is while we may have differences, theoretical differences in why we want to develop, the fact remains that technology remains a fundamental platform for the idea of development. Engineering becomes a fundamental platform. So, let's go to the next slide, sir. We want to look at the unintended outcomes of development. This is something we don't necessarily think about. Arnold Pacey, in his famous book, The Practice of Technology, makes this argument that, look, when we actually apply a technology, our developmental hat says, this is the intended outcome. This is what must happen. But the unbridled use of available resources is an unintended outcome. Right? We have not ever stopped and thought for a long period of time, what the heck we are doing down in the Amazon rainforest? When we're cutting those trees down, unbridled access to resource, right? Without stopping to think about it. We have done that with human beings. Unbridled access to resource. You're not talking about development. How bad can this unbridled use of available resources go to? What did the Americans do? What did the Americans do to grow their cotton fields? That's where I'm from. I come from the South. I live in North Carolina. What was the primary resource for the cotton fields and the tobacco fields? Slavery. Unbridled access to resource. Did that cause development? You go down to Hilton Head, you go down to Savannah. Those plantations, they're amazingly large, built on unbridled access to resource. The inattention to what else is going on. How many of you had a flu in the last 15 days? Seriously, this is a pretty healthy crowd.
That I know at least 7 or 8 people who,
Right. What do you think?
especially the kids, hand, foot and mouth disease.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah. In the last 1 month, I have known at least 20 kids who are suffering, who have been suffering from hand, foot and mouth disease.
Okay. Let's go down to the flu.
Yeah.
If you have a
There's
flu,
tomato flu also, tomato flu.
huh?
Tomato flu, which you know.
This is really scaring me. I just went through a pretty bad bout about 3 weeks ago. I don't want to get that again. What do the doctors prescribe when you get a flu?
Paracetamol and lot of water. Certain extent vitamins and
That's
electrolyte
water.
water.
Go back 15 years ago.
Chicken soup.
Chicken soup for the soul, right? That's good. That's good. Now, 15 years ago, if you had a flu, what we call a flu today, basically the symptoms are you have a fever, aches and pains, and you feel like, pardon the French, feel like shit, and you're in bed. The doctors used to prescribe antibiotics. The inattention to what else is going on. What's the first antibiotic? What's the name of the first antibiotic ever used? Penicillin. And we still call it generation 1 antibiotic. What generation are we at right now? Any idea? 5th generation. We had a 5th generation antibiotic because we used it without thinking about it. Alright? Automobiles, cars. We are a country, I'm wearing my American hat. We're a country that's built on cars. After the war, when Eisenhower comes back from the war, he looks at German autobahns that Hitler built. He creates the interstate system. What happens is he creates a political, economic problem by taking the white people, the middle class and rich white people who decided to leave the cities and go into the suburbs. Because suddenly the automobile could bring them back to their workplace. And we created the scourge of the inner city, the poor, the primarily black, right? Unintended outcomes. The intention, the inattention, creation of new problems to solve old problems. We're doing that constantly, all right? Creation of, we try to solve old problems. Look at this fellow, this really crazy guy, Elon, right? So Elon has, what kind, Elon Musk? He almost stands close to Trump in stupidity in some ways. But given what he's done, they just released, day before yesterday, the first first Musk van or truck in New York City. The thing broke more traffic rules than ever before, right? So the point is, we're trying to solve a problem. What is the problem you're solving? Well, we don't want to drive. That's the problem you're solving. We want to make this efficient and create new problems, right? The need to create demand for the production of for the products of development. This is really, really bad in many ways because development requires, remember what we said, maximization of profit. We need to sell the stuff. That's how we sold the iPod. That's why I used the iPod example, right? You could make it much, much worse. Much, much worse, and think about wars. Think about conflict. Where many would argue the American military-industrial complex has been the cause for many conflicts, right? So we need to create the demand. And in all this, we neglect the future. We completely decide that the future doesn't matter because my goal right now is maximization of my profit now, here and now. That's what development has become. It's called development without conscience. Development without conscience goes hand in hand with the construct of capitalism without conscience. Mind you, personally, I'm a hardcore capitalist. Make money. There's nothing wrong with making money. Do it the right way, you know? But when you get capitalism without conscience, that's when you get development without conscience, because things here and now. That's all that matters, right? So, the war also gives us, let me pause for a second. Is this all making sense? Yes, sir.
Sir, I have a question. There is this evergreen debate that has been going on for decades. That is regarding whether we should switch to nuclear energy or whether we should stick back to thermal. So, what's your view on that? Because lots of debate takes place on this, and again, it is directly related to sustainable development. And there have been certain, small changes. For instance, Elon Musk talks about use of electric cars. But the point is, they are using the electricity that has been created by thermal power.
Right.
So ultimately, it's a dichotomy. Right?
Yeah. So, what's your name?
So, Ritesh Tripathi.
Mr. Tripathi. Doctor, Mr. Dr. Tripathi. All right, perfect. So Dr. Tripathi is bringing up a very, very important idea, but here's the way I will respond to it. Any problem or any phenomenon can be broken down into two parts. This actually goes back to Marx, to some degree. There's always a deep structure, and the deep structure are the conflicts and the binaries, right? Good and bad, bad and good, so that kind of stuff. This deep structure has manifestations in the superstructure. Superstructure of society is where we actually live our practices, right? The fact that I'm talking here, the fact that you're here. What you're pointing to it is a superstructural problem, right? I'm talking more at the deep structure level. Everything. So my answer to you is, of course there is a problem, right? But is there a scientifically viable solution? Actually not. Not in certain parts of the world. If we take coal away, all right? So this is the whole Democratic and Republican argument in the United States, right? The Democrats want to take coal away because that's their ideological imperative. Trump wants to bring coal back, right? Keep coal. Let's say you take coal away. West Virginia, what's going to happen there? What's going to happen in the Appalachians? What's going to happen in Kentucky? What's going to happen in parts of Ohio? Even in parts of North Carolina? You know? We're going to kill the economy, right? So coal is not going to go. So the interconnection is too difficult to break apart. Nuclear is never going to happen. You know, what the heck do you do with the waste? You create a new problem. Yeah. What do you do with the waste? So solar, yes. I'm really going deep into your question, right? Solar, yes. Is it efficient yet? Not really. It's not really efficient. Okay. So we are stuck to some degree with good old coal. We are stuck to some degree with good old petroleum, right? So we are stuck with the Middle East. We can't just, unless we get our own oil sources, we're stuck with it. Those are the realities of the global economy. Things will slowly, hopefully change. Well, let's continue to talk, but in the interest of time, may I move on? Yeah. So the war gives us another thing. I'm so fixated on the war because many people would argue, that argument is coming out. The war was an inflection point in the history of the world. Things changed. And we used that. We grabbed that as a return to the League of Nations. Some of you remember the League of, well, if you've read your history, you'll remember the League of Nations, which was a complete failure, right? Which is why Hitler could happen. The United Nations comes out and says that, look, we're going to be the global body and everything. We're going to recognize the new countries. India comes in, Pakistan comes in, all of the new countries come in. But the United Nations actually does something which no other organization has done in the past, which is point towards global issues. Not just drawing the line in the line of control up in Kashmir. That's not the only thing they're doing. They come up with the UNDP, they come up with the Unicef, all of these things begin to happen. And it takes from 1945 all the way up till about 2010, 2015, it's a long period of time, when suddenly people start to realize that we are doing development in a manner that is slowly, basically neglecting the future. Some countries start to recognize that earlier. Again, I focus so much on the US because I've spent my last 30-some years in the US, so that's where much of my history has been. I left India when I was literally 24 years old and been back and forth, all of that. We go back and look at the smokestacks of Pittsburgh, look at Detroit. These are places which, there's a real story. I can't remember the exact year when it happened. How many of you remember the story of Moses? Moses from the Old Testament. One of the things that Moses did, as the legend goes, he turned water to blood. Remember that part of the story? One of the plagues, one of the seven plagues that he brought upon Egypt was turning water to blood. Scientists have looked at that for ages, over and over again. How the heck did he do that? Is that scientifically explainable? Well, it turns out about 45 miles from my town, there's a small city, and one morning the residents woke up and they went to their local river, and the river had turned red. And the water fishes were dead. What had happened is a neglect for the future. The local factory was dumping pollutants into the water, and that eventually led to that. So, in the United States, there was certain movement. Again, this is a very, very political movement. When the Republicans are there, they don't care anything about the environment. So, Trump actually wanted to get rid of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So, what ends up, I just realized I'm running out of time. Go to the next slide, please. So we get to the idea of sustainable development. Sustainable development essentially makes these arguments, which is basically saying that development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. That's the moment of change, and this was adopted. Like I said, this conversation actually started in the 90s. I'm sorry, not in 2000, in the 90s. But it was only in 2017 that this was adopted by the United Nations. It's a global adoption of a policy statement saying that we will carefully look at society, environment, culture, and economy, and we create a balanced system for a better quality of life. Not just our quality of life, but the future quality of life. And each one of these matter. Notice what they're saying. Society. Sustainable development is about resources. Remember, I made that point earlier. And those resources include human beings. So thus, sustainable human society, human systems. Sustainable system about the environment. That's easy. Everybody talks about that. The environment is going to hell in a basket. But that's only a part of it. Sustainable culture. What happens when a politician or a leader such as Trump comes in and he says that Hispanics are rapists? This is actually something he said, right? Is that sustainable culture? Is that a sustainable cultural moment? So it's sustainability in culture and surely in economy, right? Economic sustainability. So, one needs to understand that sustainable development is a process. It ends in the goals of sustainable development. It is not as if sustainable development goals is the only thing. We have to follow a process. And the United Nations adopts these 17 goals where they basically, and you can read these goals, but can this slide show be distributed to the audience here eventually? Yeah?
We will share this soft copy.
Okay, there you go, yeah. So take a look at this, guys. This is all over the place. You can look it up anyway. So these are the 17 goals that they put forward, and these 17 goals are agreed upon by the global community. I'm going to try and read this out to you a little bit. Good health and well-being. Oh, you can read it. Okay, that's good. See, you're not mine. I forget that.
It's everywhere. This is a standard picture of 17 SDGs.
Everybody's seen it. Everybody's seen
This
it.
is a standard picture.
Yeah. And the point of this is, we have adopted this. We decided we're going to do it. But where does communication come into this? If you look at these goals, what you'll start to see that there are certain goals that fundamentally assume communication. Peace, justice, and strong institutions cannot happen without dialogue, cannot happen without people talking to each other. So, where's the other one? Quality education. The fifth, gender equality. Reduce inequalities. It all requires that communication. It all requires that dialogue. So now that we know this, since you're so familiar with these 17 ones, let's move to the next slide. Where does the media industry come in? What do we do? This is where the manage has to happen. You see what I'm saying? So far we've talked about development. Where does media come in? Well, media comes in what Edmund Burke said back in the 87. He called it the fourth estate. You are the fourth estate. We are the fourth estate. And it almost comes back now. It adds up with sustainable development because we are going to be the watchdogs. That's what you have to do. So when somebody says that we are doing a development or doing something which fits in one of those 17 things, it is only the media to some degree, if it's going to be honest, that can actually watch that and say, yes, that's what's going on. Improved reporting and meeting of sustainable development goals. So the SD goals are not just, and look at the way I put it, because if you look at the way SDs are laid out, it's not just the governments, it's corporations. So there are corporations which are coming out and saying that we are going to follow the sustainable development process as we develop things. But that's where the media industry comes in. That is just the industry part of it. Journalism. Many of you are journalists or trained journalists. What do journalists know about? Do journalists know the 17 goals? It's a very basic point where you start. Do our students even know? What are the 17 goals? How do they play out? So as I say over here, the journalistic training is something that becomes more important. Greater engagement between the civil society and journalists. That has to be a part of that sustainable process so that they actually know that, well, if you're doing this kind of a development, are you taking care of certain things that will make this a sustainable process? So what does a sustainable process really mean? If you break it down to real things that we do. Recycling, a simple thing as recycling is the process of reaching that sustainable development goal. What we did here was it in India or was it just in West Bengal? About a month and a half back, when we decided a certain thickness of plastic bags will be banned. Was that nationwide? It was nationwide, right? Now, when you look at that decision, you say, notice what you have just done. Yes, you have taken away that plastic out of circulation, but you have hit the economy in a pretty bad way because a lot of people relied on that as a packaging material to supply their products, right? A sustainable moment would be figure out how to collect that back and recycle that and put it back into the system. Now, if somebody comes up and says that, that's where the media comes in and says, okay, they're saying they're going to do this. Are they actually doing it? What is the problem with much of this sustainability? I'm digressing a little bit. It is cost. Eventually, it's money, right? Why did the Americans move their production to China and Mexico? When America suddenly started to get into sustainable development and sustainability, this is way, as before the United Nations comes in. What was the reason that the corporations left? Huh? That is, Dr. Tripathi just said it's cheap labor, and that is partially the answer. You know why they left? And this would happen to India as well, and happen to many countries.
Dumping of the plastic.
Not dumping of the plastics, but it's a regulatory moment.
So lowering their carbon emissions basically.
Sorry?
Their intention was to lower their carbon emission in-house so that they can shift their industry to China and other places where they could get cheap labor, as well as those countries did not care about the carbon emission.
The government policy
At that
is
point,
Yeah, the regulatory.
to grow
But
their economy.
But the way you have narrated the story is an idealized, I wish that was true. The reason the guys left is not because they suddenly said, oh, we're going to be so nice to the environment in the United States, I don't care about the environment in China. That's not why they left. They left because the government made it so expensive to create a factory in the US that they said, okay, I'm going to go build it in China. See what I'm saying? So that's where the media comes in. Why aren't they leaving? What can the government do? So that's the watchdog part of it. Next. Where does the media ecology come in? We need global conversations. We need to have a situation where we. Did you have a question? Yeah. Are we creating a media ecology? By media ecology, I simply just mean the media space. All of the pieces that are connected together. Are we giving attention to the things that are happening? Look at the way in which technology has actually helped in sustaining certain processes. Let's say the cell phone technology, right? The cell phone technology, which is so highly penetrated all across the world. What are they doing in Africa? They're actually using the cell phone for the fishermen who go out to the sea, catch the fish, and they get back. They talk on the cell phone to figure out what the shore prices would be. Some countries have a plethora of global issues, as you can read this, I don't have to read this. But we can, within that media ecology, forge the connection, bring the connections between civil society, bring the connections between the experts and the people, right? The people who are actually going through the process of sustainable practices. We're also getting into converged platforms. This is the other part of the media ecology that's happening. Much of what I'm saying here presumes a very traditional media system, institutional media that is like basically news and so forth. But we've gone beyond that. Okay? When you talk about sustainable development, see, this is where we have to move away from technology to some degree. How has what we call social media, or the digital networks, how has that changed things? We announced it, remember how I said sustainable development is about culture? Sustainable development is also about politics, to some degree. Real life examples, get dirt, get down with the data. Think about what happened with George Floyd. When Floyd was held down by the police in Minneapolis, how the heck did the world know about it? How the heck did the black movement, that Black Lives Matter, suddenly get re-energized? One young woman worked within that media ecology, recorded that thing, perhaps never understanding what the heck she's starting, right? And put it up. And to a large degree, I would argue, and the data would argue, that Trump lost eventually because of everything that happened with that, right? So that's a developmental moment where the media ecology helps us. Where does media technology come in? This is kind of interesting to me because I'm a technologist, because I come back to communication technology. We have created technologies such as the ones I have over there, digital devices, access to the digital devices. Everybody has, not everybody, well actually everybody, a huge population now has access to a digital device and access to the digital network, right? And we can use that to get the word out of how to, it's just simple as PSA. This goes back to the idea of recycling, goes back to the idea of some habits at the individual level that we can do differently. Why don't we use that? That's the kind of question that I'm raising. I'm really out of time. Let's go to the last slide. I don't want to get into this. media consumption is another part of where it comes in. Because we set the agenda. This goes back to the Chapel Hill study of Armin Shaw, 868, agenda setting, very basic idea in media. We set the agenda. If we, as journalists, are people who are teaching journalism, people who are training journalists, we keep in mind that what you say matters. Although it is the case that truth has disappeared, right? Truth is a myth. But even within that environment, as long as we are speaking, access to timely information, those are the things that can help in sustainability. So with that, go to the very last slide. Let me shut up. I've been going on for 45 minutes. 45 minutes, I used it up. So, if anybody's interested, if you can actually see that QRC, that will give you my website, my academic website. But let me shut up. Questions, comments, let's open it up. I have time, whatever conversations you like. Not that I have answers.
About this carbon trading, and now all over the world, this is the new concept of trading. Okay, and monopolize the power, capital power, because of they are projecting fake kind of reforestation and deforestation theory, and they are just dumping these Asian area countries, and they create that this is a modern concept of this carbon trading.
Again, in the superstructure, there's so many ways in which sustainable development, although the United Nations wants to claim that it is a global effort, it will take a lot of mediated dialogue to make it truly a global effort, because the cost of it, the financial cost of it, is also another part of it, which is where you're going in some ways. That carbon trading actually has now been monetized. There's actual money that's being exchanged because of that. So when you buy an airplane ticket nowadays, you pay for a carbon fee, and you're saying, really, this is who's getting this money? That's where media comes in, right? Sir.
Yeah, please. Yes, we got a mic.
You can on that. Yes.
So actually I'm audible, I think.
Yeah.
The space button.
Yes. No, you can.
If you use the mic, it'll be captured over there.
Okay, got it. Actually, you more talked about the base superstructure factor.
Sorry?
Base superstructure factor of Marx. What is your take on this concept that post-COVID situation has probably led to a situation of technological determinism 2.0?
To where?
The post-COVID situation has led us towards technological determinism 2.0.
I would completely agree with that. So let's go back to technological determinism so that everybody is clear on that construct.
Because ideology remains the same, the base remains same.
Right. So yes and no. Yeah, this is a really interesting question. Show it, right? Yeah. Chatterjee? Dr. Chatterjee. Okay, this is Chatterjee, Professor Chatterjee. Never say no, that's not true. So technological determinism as a concept basically makes the argument that if the technology exists, we will use it. And it comes, many of you know that, it comes from the basic idea that the technologist is only interested in creating a technology. That's all they're interested in. There are other groups of people who will sell it and we will really use it. That is the classical technology practice triangle that basically gives us. And your point is the base as an ideological base has not changed. We are still struggling with the same kind of dichotomies, the same kind of differences, the same vectors that divide us, right? On the superstructure, if I'm understanding you right, in our everyday practice, what ended up happening with COVID is we said technology will come to the rescue. And thus we made the argument that if we have the technology, we will solve this problem, right? And it was completely a technological moment without actually thinking at the superstructure level how the technology will get deployed, how that technology will be used, and all of that was forgotten. And that's exactly what ended up happening, right? So there are countries, such as the United States, such as parts of Western Europe, which had the vaccine right up front, right? The December 24th of what year is this, 22? December 24th of 2020 is when I got my first vaccine from Pfizer, right? Who's not even around over here. But the technological deterministic process, and even when we got the vaccine, I had no idea what the heck I'm getting and what it's going to do, but there was a huge trust in technology. What did we do here in India, in Israel, in China? We did our apps. The technology took over. Imagine how powerful that app was. Aral Crochet, wasn't that the name of the app? Right? We were being tracked, right? So technology came in such a way that even though the vectors and the base remain the same, we just gave into the technology. And I don't know, who's here from St. Xavier? You're here from St. Xavier's, right? From this institution. Can anybody walk into this room, or is this room controlled by a key card?
Not even into the gate, sir.
Sorry?
Not even into the gate.
Not even into the gate.
That's an ID card.
You need it's a swipe?
ID card.
But
The
physical ID card. But does they record the information that you're coming in?
The security.
I'm going.
We have the biometric attendance system.
Ah.
Unless we are not giving the biometric attendance, we will be marked absent.
Was that available before COVID? Did COVID bring that in?
Yeah, before COVID it was introduced, but during COVID it was locked because it may spread through this finger cards.
Okay, but
Only for the faculty.
Only for the faculty.
not for this, but I'll tell you my story, alright? So, soon as COVID comes in, Wake Forest shuts down, and Wake Forest said we're closed for a length of time. And when we start opening up, they say that we can only let people in who are Wake Forest people because we know they have the vaccine or they've done something. Technology comes to the rescue, right? What do? We do locks on every possible door in every possible building, and you have to swipe in. Technological determinism, the technology exists, not for a moment thinking what amount of privacy I'm just giving up. Right? How do you beat the system? I said, I am not going to let my institution know when I go into the building. So many people like me figured it out. Well, how do you beat the system? What do you do when you get into a building without swiping in? I asked undergraduate students this day before yesterday. They came up with the answer. You better come up with the answer. Your students know how to beat the system. He's laughing. You know how to beat the system? No? You wait for somebody to swipe. They open. The door opens and you walk right behind that person. Nobody ever knows who's walking in behind them, especially in a college, in a university building, right? So the university has no idea when I went in for the entire COVID period. I just used to wait. What's the point of giving me my information? So, technological determinism, right? We went off to online teaching. So, because the question is so interesting, and COVID comes into the game. Many of you did online teaching, right? Some of you hated it, right? Absolutely. Do you realize that without online teaching, I would not be standing here right now? Right? I did not hate it. As a matter of fact, a lot of people like me, and there's not a whole lot of research on this yet, but that'll come out. Do you do when you did online teaching, all of you, many of your teachers, you were did you record it? You recorded it, right? And it was available to the students later on? Very nice. Did the students like that? Without a doubt. They didn't have to pay attention in class. There's nothing better for a student to do than not to pay attention in class. Because you know you'll get it, you have it, you'll get back to it. Alright? But once COVID went away and you went back to normal teaching, the students suddenly lost their ability. And the students suddenly panicked. They said, I have to actually pay attention, which is very difficult for more than 7 minutes for most of our students, right? right? So I figured that, look, I gotta use this. This is an anecdote. I gotta use this because I want to be in Kolkata. I want to get started with Winston-Salem in the entire semester. How the heck do I convince my students that this is still a good idea to continue with online? I'm not allowed to do online, right? So what I ended up doing is I actually do the class like this, except I'm also on camera on Zoom, so the whole class is getting recorded. Students love it. I make them come to class, but then when I am not in Winston, I say that, look, listen, you can come to the classroom, I'll be on Zoom. And they've gotten used to it by now, and they love the recording. Technological determinism. Technology determined how we will teach, and then we dropped it. So this is why I say we missed the COVID opportunity. It's such a harsh thing to say, and so many people died. But COVID gave us an inflection point, and I think we missed it. We did not use that inflection point as well as we could have. I'm going to shut up. Unless there are questions.
Sir, good afternoon. Yes, my name is Dr. I want to know specific questions. Actually, I am both in news field of reporting and as well as I teach. So, from the point of view from the students, just give me a clear conception. The one example, the big investors and the industrialists, when they carted all the stones from the Vedanta, likely the Vedanta group, they are doing all this from the Odisha. But the thing is that who was living there, the tribals, they was opposed them. Government is saying it's for the development, but those who was there and the ground journalist who was there also, if they write in behalf of them, they have been arrested and the government says they are against development. So tell me clearly, what is the correct and the proper shape of development? How we teach our student of journalist who wants to go to be a journalist, that when you will cover, you cover from these point of view. Just to mention that thing.
Right. I don't teach journalism, but my theoretical answer to you would be, the journalists should be trained to know the basic, let's say SDGs, the basic ideas of SDG, the idea of equality, the idea of fairness, the idea of cleanliness of the environment. As long as they understand these 17 things, they can and should be able to write their story without necessarily politicizing it, but keeping it within the theory of SDG and say that, look, this is what's going on. And the United Nations and India has signed on to this, but we are actually not doing this. That is not anti-development, but go to the basic. These are the 17 rules, these are the 17 guiding lines. Am I following the guiding lines? If I'm not following the guiding lines, point it out. The story is that these guidelines have not been followed. That does not have to lead to the conclusion by the journalist that this is anti-development or pro-development. It's a statement of fact. What you say, sir, is a far deeper issue in journalism and media reporting than just about SDGs. We have lost, without a doubt, we have lost those moments of Ed Murrow's. When Ed Murrow says at the end, and this is how it is, that is gone. We don't do that anymore because we now tell a news story. We don't tell news. We are story writers. We have to create the narrative, and thus we need. So my answer to that, when I do teach a little bit of writing for media. If you're writing for media, yes, you write a story. That's what brings in the money, right? But if the journalist really just tells the way it is, I do not see a huge problem with that. There will be repercussions, right? That the journalist wrote this. Did he or she mean that this is anti-development or pro-development? That's what so remember how I said we didn't go through that slide. The audience is to decide. But the journalist or me as a writer states it the way it is. Unfortunately, the 17 SDGs, is this being followed? Did India say that we're going to follow these? If we did, right here I can show you it's not being followed. Equivalent of that is exactly what I told you about George Floyd. A police officer is not supposed to use unusual force to pull down a man. Black, white, red, whatever be the color of the man, or the police officer. What that video did, it showed unfair use of force. Then let the conversations go on. Does that make sense?
So I know we're running out of time. A small, very unsettling question I want to put forward. I may not be very clear. I'm Sitara. I've recently joined this department in St. Xavier's. So I was thinking about technology in anti and pro-development concepts, and I'm more on the anti-development concepts. Why? Because I hope you have heard about this hikikomori as a cultural concept in Japan, where
Yes.
social withdrawal is happening, and with the pandemic, reproduction not happening or intimacy is not happening. Isn't it very troubling? What is your say? Let it be infertility or people not being able to be human anymore by interacting to each other. That's somewhere a very core question that always pops up in mind, especially when we talk about sustainability and so many other things.
Right. And I think that falls in with the SDGs in some degree, because the SDGs also talk about sustainability within culture. And that's what you're talking about. I am by no means an expert or educated in the issue of sexuality and infertility. But I would be able to make this part of the argument that there's sufficient evidence to show through research in psychology and to some degree research in communication that certain generations of people are increasingly disconnected from human contact, right? So when we go through the lockdown and the social distancing and all of that, that was unusual and cruel treatment, right? And so we get distance. But that does not necessarily mean that they're lacking in a community or a network. And that's the idea of virtual communities. Way back in the 90s, late 90s, when we were writing about virtual communities, Steve Jones and I were publishing our books on that, we made the argument that communities can be created in the virtual. And that is what has entirely happened. Because look at the way we're living on WhatsApp, right? It is possible to claim that you can never be lonely if you have WhatsApp, right? Somebody somewhere is putting out some bullshit, right? You will see that. But the point is, does that mean that you are not lonely in the physical sense? Not at all. You're lonely. We are finding the technology as a surrogate to deal with that loneliness that we physically are feeling, right? But at the same time, I'm a very pro-technology person, as you can tell. I'm really hardcore pro-technology. I love technology. I'm almost technologically determined. And there's certain things that are impossible without technology. In fact, online teaching. Forget online teaching. I'm here. I spend 6 weeks over here. I spend 6 weeks back in the US. My family, my wife is in the US, and she cannot travel with me all the time. Every morning for an hour, we actually talk more when I am here than when I am there. Does that make sense? Because we have the dedicated time. We're sitting in front of that WhatsApp thing and we're just chatting, right? I don't know. This needs more research. I don't know because I don't have data. I will not make a comment without data, but once you have the data, this is what we are looking at. Absolutely. I'll tell you a book to read on that. Go back to Sherry Turkle. Sherry Turkle's book that came out early 2000s, Life on the Screen. Go back and look at that. This is way before all of this, right? Or go back to our books. Steve Jones was the editor. I had a piece in both Virtual Community and Virtual Commonality. These are books that dealt with these issues way before all of the technology was even developed that far. I have no idea of time. I have absolutely lost.
I would ask a question.
Somebody said, yeah.
Most of the time we talk about development, we talk in terms of economic science and technology. Can we think of development in terms of art, literature, philosophy? Like the Renaissance in Europe, I think the Renaissance in Europe was a driving factor. Because of the European Renaissance, the scientific and technological development happened.
Absolutely. I mean, European Renaissance was we moved away from the Middle Ages to understand that everything is not on the same plane. There is depth you can show. Without a doubt, the art, art, and if you maximize, if you expand the idea of art, look at film. Look at how film has changed and how film has developed. Is that sustainable development? I don't necessarily know. No, I don't have any basis to answer that question. But in the developmental process, the practices of art and the expression of art, not just art as in a major painting by Picasso or Dali, but what we do in our everyday lives, that has a huge impact. Think about it this way. Again, I go back to Britain. After the war, when Americanization is coming into Britain heavily, there arises in Leeds, in Liverpool, in the whole country of Britain, the March. Ever heard of the March? M-O-T-S? Probably not. The March was a movement that came before the punks. So you all know the punk movement. So the punk movement comes as a music movement. Start talking about music. As a musical movement, and that's a development in music. We're moving away from the jazz the African jazz that we're playing in the United States. All of a sudden, we are taking the guitar and using it in a different way. Today, when punk groups, I've grown up with punk. I'm a hardcore punk person. I mean, way back from when I was 10 years old, 12 years old, back in Solid. When I used to play my music, my neighbors used to complain because I used to blast it. You're talking about, you don't even know these groups. These are hardcore, distorted guitar, heavy drums, that kind of stuff. What we call metal bands, right? That become punk and metal. All these are moments of development in my estimation. And there's a whole lot written about it, right? Film has been like that. When movies change, when the genre changes happen, and come back to the more recent times, go to 1970. Haven't you watched 1917? 1917 was a movie that came out pre-COVID.
Yes, sir.
You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, so this is a movie that's shot, it looks as shot as a one-shot movie, 2.5 hour movie. Development. Absolutely. Now, I agree with you. This is part of it. And the British Cultural Studies movement is based on the notion of cultural change and cultural development. You do British culture. When Heritage writes, he talks about the Marx. Exactly. So then he goes on to the punks and so forth. But sorry, this gets me really excited. It takes me back to my music. Okay, well, that was fun.
Thank you, Mr. You explained very well different aspects related to developmental goal and what's the relation of communication. So I'm hopeful that these deliberations were very fruitful for you. Just continuing further, I would like to invite Shomuk sir. Please come forward, and we are going to start with our next resource person.
Thank you. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much, sir.
Enjoyed it. A great crowd, right?
Sir, could you pose once again, please?
Yeah.
I didn't capture.
Sure.
Chetan sir, yeah.
Who's getting it to
I know, exactly.
the recipient in the
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Anybody Shomik, you took some pictures, right? During the talk?
Yes, sir, we
Sir,
did.
we have-
Sir, we did.
Yes, just send me a couple of pictures, that's all.
I didn't provide it.
Alright guys, good luck.